It's important that the first step is to recognize the type of method that you're going to use, the technique that you will use in order to factor. And you will see several examples that will help you with that. In order to be successful with this technique, there are basic algebra operations that you need to know. That is to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. You also need to be competent at the grouping method that was explained in a previous voice thread. You see 5 examples on the board. In this voice thread, I will help you factor these 5 expressions. But before, think about this. Think about what you notice in these 5 examples. What's the same? What's different? What do you call this, do you think? The next slide will give you some tips. Now, in all these 5 examples, we have 3 terms, a trinomial. They are in decreasing order of exponents. What does that mean? Here, the exponent is 2. Here, the exponent is 1. And here, well, there is no variable. We say the exponent is 0. And they're all the same. They're all in decreasing order of exponents. Now, if you can remember, in the easy trinomials, it was the same thing. But here's the difference. Here's the difference between the easy trinomial and the decomposition method. The coefficient of the first term is not 1. Notice, here it's 2, here it's 12, here it's 6, 14, and 49. We say that this is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Just like in the prior voice threads, you have this chart. You have this mind map that will help you decide what factoring method to use. Always ask yourself the question, is there a GCF? If there is none, ask yourself how many terms. So in this voice thread, there will be 3 terms, but it's going to be the decomposition because there will be a coefficient other than 1 with the variable squared. So these are the steps that I'm going to go through when you recognize that the decomposition method is the technique to factor an expression. So you've recognized that it's the decomposition method. There are 3 terms. They're in decreasing order of exponents, and the coefficient of the variable squared is a number other than 1. Here's what you have to do. You've got to multiply that first coefficient by the last coefficient. That will give to you positive 14. Then think of 2 numbers. When multiplied together, give you the coefficient of that newfound number, positive 14. And when added, give you the coefficient of the middle term, which is 15. Can you find those 2 numbers from what you've learned about finding 2 numbers in the easy trinomials? So the 2 numbers are 14, positive 14 and positive 1. When you add positive 14 and positive 1, it gives you positive 15. That's the coefficient of the middle term. When you multiply those 2 numbers, 14 times 1, it gives you positive 14, which gives you that newfound number. Now, what are we going to do with those 2 numbers? Here's what's different. You're going to decompose the middle term. That's where we get the expression, the decomposition method. The first term stays exactly the same. The last term stays exactly the same, but you're going to rewrite that middle term, the 15x, using those two numbers that you found, 14 and positive 1. That will give to you 2x squared plus 14x plus 1x plus 7. So you decompose the middle term using those two numbers that you found. Do you recognize something now? Is there a method that we learned in previous voice threads that will help you? Yeah, it's the grouping method. We have four terms. Whenever we have four terms, we can use the grouping method. So we have created the grouping method by decomposing the middle term. We group the first two terms and the last two terms. Do you remember what the steps are? Try to think of them. So after you've grouped those terms, you look for a GCF of each group. GCF of 2x squared plus 14x is 2x because I can divide 2x evenly into those two terms that I've grouped. The last two terms, well, there is no common factor, but it's safe to put that plus 1. What are you going to do next? You're going to divide those two terms, 2x and positive 1, into these expressions here. So 2x squared divided by 2x is x, and 14x divided by 2x is positive 7. When I divide positive 1 into those two terms, I will get x plus 7. What happens next? Our common factor is a binomial, is x plus 7. What are we left with when we divide? 2x plus 1. Our two factors are x plus 7 times 2x plus 1. Now remember, you can always FOIL to verify. Why don't I verify this with you? X plus 7 times 2x plus 1. If we're going to FOIL to verify, x times 2x is 2x squared. X times positive 1 is positive x. 7 times 2x is positive 14x, and 7 times positive 1 is positive 7. I can collect my middle terms, my like terms, 2x squared plus 15x plus 7. I'm correct in my factors. That was the original question. So I've got a lot of practice questions for you in order to apply the decomposition method. Why don't you try it before I show you all the steps? Do you remember what you have to do once you've recognized that it's the decomposition method? You're going to multiply the first coefficient by the last coefficient. 12 times 20 is equal to 240. You're going to look for two numbers. Two numbers when added together give you the coefficient of the middle term. When multiplied give you coefficient of that newfound number. Now this is where that calculator activity, that I provided in the previous voice thread. That will help you because our numbers are larger. So two numbers when multiplied together give you positive 240. When added, give you positive 31. Take out that calculator, divide 240 by 1, divide 240 by 2, etc., until you find the correct combination. The two numbers are positive 15 and positive 16. Always verify after you find those two numbers. What do you do after that? Remember, we're going to decompose the middle term using those two numbers, 15 and 16. If we're going to decompose the middle term, you've got to put 15x plus 16x. That is the same as 31x. We've created a grouping method. We're going to group the first two terms and the last two terms, and we're going to look for a common factor in each group. The common factor in the first two terms is 3x. The common factor in the last two terms is positive 4. Get into the habit of putting that positive 4. How are we going to find what's in the bracket? We've got to divide 12x squared by 3x and 15x divided by 3x. We also have to divide 16x by 4 and 20 by 4. What does that give to you? 4x plus 5. Now that is the indication that you're doing this correctly. When you do the grouping method and you group and you divide by that GCF for each group, you should get the same expression. Now we know what our factors are. We've got a common factor of 4x plus 5. We divide 4x plus 5 into each of those terms, and that gives to us 3x plus 4. Go ahead, practice your FOIL and verify that we have the correct factors. Again, why don't you try this using the steps that I provided? Don't look at the answers yet. Look at them once you're done. Did you remember to multiply the first coefficient by the last coefficient? Did that give you 120? Then, did you use this template? That is to look for two numbers when added give you the coefficient of the middle term, which is 23. When multiplied, gave you the coefficient of that newfound number, which is 120. Did you use your calculator in order to find the two numbers? Did you get that the two numbers were positive 15 and positive 8? What do you do with those two numbers? You're going to decompose the middle term. 23x, I'm going to rewrite it using 15x and 8x. Now, it doesn't matter what order you do it. It usually works whether you use 8x plus 15x or 15x plus 8x. It has now become a grouping method because we have 4 terms. In the grouping method, we group the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms. We do the factoring method separately. We find a GCF in each group. GCF in the first term, in the first 2 terms, is 2x, and the GCF in the last 2 terms is 5. This is what we do. 2x, and we place our brackets because we've got to find what the other factor is in the grouping of the first 2 terms, and get into the habit of putting your plus, if it's a plus. How do we find what's in the brackets? We divide that GCF into each term of each group. In this case, if I divide 2x into 6x squared and 8x, that will give to me 3x plus 4. The last 2 terms, when I divide that GCF into both terms, 15x divided by 5 is 3x, and 20 divided by 5 is 4. Notice how I've got a common factor in each of those terms. It's a binomial common factor. I'm going to place that common factor of 3x plus 4, and remember to put brackets. And then when I divide 3x plus 4 into both terms, I'm going to get my other factor, which is 2x plus 5. Did you get that? Did you verify your work? Now, when negatives are involved, you have to be extra careful. First step, recognize that it's decomposition. Why? 3 terms, decreasing order of exponents, and we have a number in front of the variable squared. So you're going to multiply that first number by the last. 14 times 3 is equal to positive 42. So 2 numbers, when added together, give you the coefficient of the middle term, and when multiplied, give you the coefficient of that newfound number. So take your time, be careful with negatives, and look for those 2 numbers. And I'll show you on the next slide. So the 2 numbers are negative. When added, these 2 numbers are negative 13. Negative 6 plus a negative 7 is negative 13. That's the middle coefficient. And Negative 6 times negative 7 is a positive 42, and that's that newfound number. What are we going to do with the negative 6 and the negative 7? We're going to decompose the middle term using those two numbers as coefficients of the x. Our new expression, 14x squared minus 6x minus 7x plus 3. This becomes a grouping method because we have four terms. So we're going to group the first two terms and the last two terms. Why don't you try and do this before I show you the next step? So the next step is to look at each of those groups separately and look for a GCF. In the first two terms, the GCF is 2x. In the last two terms, and be careful when there's a negative, in the last two terms, when that first term in the second group is negative, we usually make the GCF negative. The GCF is negative 1. What do we do with the GCF of each term? We've got to divide that GCF into both terms in order to get the other factor. Same here. I'm going to divide both of those terms by negative 1 to get this factor. Why don't you try that? If I look at the first two terms, I found the GCF of 2x. I divide 2x into both terms. That gives to me 7x minus 3. The second group, my GCF is negative 1. I divide negative 1 into both terms. That will give to me my other factor as 7x minus 3. What do I do now? I've got a GCF that's a binomial. My GCF that's a binomial is 7x minus 3. How do I get the other factor? I'm going to place my brackets. I divide 7x minus 3 into both terms. What's remaining? 2x minus 1. My factors are 7x minus 3, 2x minus 1. One more example, and this is a special case that comes along with language that you need to be familiar with. So the instructions are factor. Factor 49x squared minus 14x plus 1. You notice that it's decomposition. Three terms, decreasing order of exponents, and the coefficient of the variable squared is a number other than 1. The strategy is, the technique is, multiply the first number by the last number. 49 times 1 is positive 49. Then look for two numbers that give you, when you add them, the coefficient of the middle term, which is negative 14, and when added, give you the coefficient of that newfound number, which is positive 49. Take a moment, look for those two numbers. Do you notice why I say it's special? We'll talk about the language in a few moments, but those two numbers are -7 and -7. When I add them, it gives you -14. When I multiply them, it gives you +49. What do we do with those two numbers? We're going to decompose the middle term using those two numbers as the numerical coefficient. So we're going to rewrite 49x squared minus 7x minus 7x plus 1. It is now a grouping method. The grouping method, what are we going to do? We group the first two terms and the last two terms. Why don't you take a moment and try this? So if I look at the first two terms only, common factor is 7x. That's why I place it in front of the brackets. In order to get the other factor, I divide 7x into both terms. The last two terms, you're going to say, well, there's nothing common. You're right, except that we've got a -7x. Whenever that third term is negative, normally the GCF will be a -1. In order to get the other factor, I've got to divide that -1 into both terms. When I do that, for the first two terms, when I divide that GCF into both terms, I get 7x minus 1. In the second group, when I divide that GCF, which is -1, I've got to divide -1 into both terms, and that gives to me 7x minus 1. Now, do you see it's designed that way to take the -1 as a GCF? Because now I have binomials that are identical in both terms. My GCF is 7x minus 1. When I divide 7x minus 1 into both terms, what am I left with? 7x minus 1. Do you notice something particular about these two factors? The next slide will show you what the language is that you need to know. Do you remember before we said 49 was a perfect square? Why is 49 a perfect square? Because 49 is the same as 7 times 7. 49x squared minus 14x plus 1 is a perfect square. Why is that? Because when we factored it, and we factored this a while ago, we have two factors that are identical. We can write this expression as 7x minus 1 squared. Just like our 49, we can write as 7 squared. It's important that you understand that a perfect square means that when you factor it, the two factors are identical. So I hope you can practice more decomposition methods. I hope that you will be able to use these steps. Good luck with your factoring.